develops in a typical child. So I reference here the Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis. This is one of our main journals that we kind of go to for research in the field. It's just defined as one of the earliest forms of communication in young children, and it involves the coordination of attention between a social partner and an object or event in the environment. So it can be where two people mutually look at an object and then turn and look back at the person. And one of the big components that we're going to talk about is this gaze shift. So it's looking at an object and then back again at the person to kind of communicate that interest or that attention to an object or an event. Also defined is that and what we're going to talk about throughout the morning today is two forms of joint attention. The first is a response to another person's bid for attention, which can really be defined as looking at an item that an adult is referencing for joint attention, and then also initiations for joint attention. And I'm going to show you a little video real fast, just to kind of demonstrate. And this is going to be, in the video I'm going to set it up before. First of all, I just have to warn you, it's a little bit choppy. The camera kind of moves a little bit, so I'll just give you that heads up. But in the video, you're going to see a child who is how old?
4.
He's 4 years old in the video. And what you'll see happen is a toy on a table. It actually goes off. So he's playing with his father. And there's a toy on a table that kind of grabs his attention. And what you're going to see is you're going to see the child look at the toy on the table and then look actually not just at the father but the person who's videotaping him as well. So but that's the engaged joint attention, and then he looks back at the toy. Almost be like, hey, look at that, look at what I'm seeing. So this is what joint attention looks like, an initiation.
Can I throw something else out real quick? If it's not too choppy, we thought we would just kind of jump in here and there. In the video, it's a Lightning McLean toy, so thank God for cars too, right? It's the big car, and it's the one that talks. So to solicit joint attention, first it's just the audio. You'll hear an audio cue about a spy. You'll hear just like some darts shooting, and none of that solicits his attention, which I know you're going to go over to in a little bit. So that's not the part for the joint attention that we're looking for, because it didn't create joint attention. So then it's at the end of the video. So if you can tolerate the jumpy, I'm responsible for that. Actually, it didn't look like that in the original.
That's the car on the table.
What else does he have in his head?
So you can see right there, the car goes off the table, and he looks not just at his father, but also at the camera person, just kind of to indicate that, hey, I saw something going on. He's initiating, excuse me, that joint attention. Sorry.
We did say, I can jump in for a second, that it's very tricky when we teach joint attention. You'll see how important it is to use some remote activated things. When you're filming it, it's a different story because you're embedded in the situation, and then I look like I'm the partner. So that was kind of tricky because you really don't want to have somebody else there. You want it to be where the attention goes right back to the play partner.
And you could also look at this example too. We could flip it and look at it. How would this be a response to joint attention, just to kind of show a difference between an initiation for a bid and a response for joint attention? If Dr. Barbin had been there and said, hey, look, it's your favorite car from Cars 2, and then the child went and looked at the toy with her, and then they started to play with it, that's a response to joint attention, because again, there's some sort of adult interaction to try to bring the child's attention to something, versus in the initiation for a bid, there's something going on in the environment, and the child then looks to the adult for that joint attention. Anything else to add?
No, so that was an example of the initiation for, obviously.
So just wanted to go over just a couple examples of joint attention, just what it would look like. So it's just some other examples of response to another person. Could be if you're walking to Target with a child, and again, you might see that favorite toy item. It might be a Barbie, and the adult says, hey, look, it's Barbie. And the child goes and looks over at Barbie, and chances are the joint attention that you're going to get is, hey, buy me that Barbie. But again, that's that joint attention there. Initiation for joint attention, and we're going to talk about in typically developing children, is actually one of the earliest forms of joint attention that develops, is that initiation. So it could even be that a child sees their bottle on the counter. They look at the bottle, and then they look at mom or dad. How many people are parents in here? You know, and you see that initially come about, or maybe you're tickling the child, and you stop, and they look up at you to get that more tickling. It's that interactive, it's that initiation for joint attention. And it actually serves as one of the earliest forms of communication for children, which is why we're going to talk about joint attention as being such a crucial skill to teach children. So development in a typically developing child, at ages 9 to 18 months, you're actually going to start to see that coordinated gaze shift between an object or event in the environment and a familiar person. So it could be between seeing that bottle, it can be that initial smile when an adult walks into the room, but it's seeing, there might be an object, it might be their favorite toy, it could be that bottle, it could even be a parent. I mean, it might even be, I know that, after, a husband walks in after a long day at work and the child's with the mother, they look immediately to the father and then back at the mom to almost say, hey, look who's home. But it's that joint attention. It's looking at a person, an object, or an event, and then looking back at a person to communicate that with someone. And then also at that time, they begin to respond to adults' bids for joint attention and to initiate joint attention in response to an interesting object or event. So again, around this age too, you'll see a child start to say, start to respond to yours. If you say, oh, let's go look for your Elmo doll, they'll start kind of looking in the direction of where the Elmo is, starting to respond to what the parent is saying. So these are kind of the earliest ways that we start to see joint attention developing. And one thing I did want to mention, the initiation does develop prior to the responding. So that's one thing that we're going to look at in the teaching of it, and why we'll teach initiations to joint attention first is because it is what typically develops in a child first. So delays in joint attention. And here's where we kind of start to see a couple of red flags, start to be on the lookout right here. It was with delays in joint attention. In the absence of joint attention before 1 year of age, it's one of the earliest symptoms and indicators of autism. So the child's not responding to the parent. They're not looking at a favorite object or toy and smiling to show that interest, or even just responding to when they see an adult walk into the room. By 9 to 18 months of age, a child should be really familiar with their primary caregivers, that when one of them walks into the room, they're shifting their gaze between the adults that are in the room. And then also children with autism, they're more likely to respond to bids for joint attentions. They're more likely to hear someone say, hey, look, it's your favorite Elmo, than they are to initiate that interaction. And with that being said, it's really important to know that children with autism, they might be on track with joint attention. We're not going to say that every child with autism has delays in joint attention, because not every child with autism does. They might be on track, they just might have some delays, and they may never develop joint attention. And it's for the children that may never naturally develop the joint attention that it is so crucial to go in and to assess, to see where they are with this skill, as well as to develop programming to teach that skill to them.
Or Jessica, the other thing is qualitatively it might be impaired. So it might take a lot of animation or a certain kind of item to elicit it.
Absolutely.
So it can be a sort of subtle call.
Absolutely. It could be that you need something huge in order to get them to pay attention to that joint attention. In the video, the little boy was really engaged with the activity that he was doing with his father, but you can see we tried a couple of different things to kind of elicit that joint attention, that bid, but it wasn't until he had the big boom there, that he really started to engage in that joint attention. I think it's a great
Yeah, because he seemed to have joint attention with the father.
Yeah.
Fine.
Absolutely.
Okay.
He did. He had joint attention with the father. It was just looking at, to demonstrate what that initiation would look like. But he was absolutely totally engaged in a reciprocal play with the father in that moment. Sorry. So looking at why is it so important to teach joint attention and to assess it and to really figure out where a child strengths might be with joint attention as well there might be some deficits with joint attention. It attracts an adult's attention to meet a social goal, sharing information or an experience. When we talk about the importance of joint attention, we're really going to be talking about it serves as a building block for social skills, it serves as a building block for communication. So it's really a way for the child to gain an adult's attention and begin to share information. Initially, when a child is 9 to 18 months old, they're sharing, hey, I'm excited that you're home. Or, hey, I see my bottle and I'm really hungry, so get the bottle over to me. So that's really what it serves at, its initial purpose when a child's really young. It is a pivotal point in a child's social and communicative development because it signals the development of processes that provide a foundation for language development as well as social competence. So initially we're going to talk about MANs, which essentially is making a request for a preferred item or an activity. To get that joint attention, it's identifying the communicative partner. So the child first gains the attention and says, look, and then they look back at the object, and eventually it's going to lead to that child actually being able to put language with it to make that request, to communicate what that need is. And then it increases the child's awareness of the environment of other people. With joint attention, you're going to get a child that's much more aware of what's going on around him or her. They're going to be more involved in looking around the environment, more aware of people, what people are doing, what objects are doing, things that are just going on in the environment. So it's really important just to increase a child's awareness of the environment. And then, as I said before, it's a prerequisite skill for many communication and social skills.
I could just make one comment on this part, because we've mentioned a couple times about the examples being the child requesting something, and we know joint attention is not just requesting something. So there's a subtle part there, and we call them verbal operants, how we break down language and teach language, and mixed with the request is joint attention, but they co-occur a lot of times. So there is a separation there. We have to make that distinction. When we were talking about examples, we're really clear to say it's not just asking for something, it's gaining joint attention, and joint attention is not always just getting attention to get something and get a need met. As the first point here is, it's also a social reciprocity too. Distinction there.
So just to look at, we're going to look in terms of how initiations are learned as well as how responses for joint attention are learned. So right here we're going to break down how we look at a skill. And just in general, we're always looking at the three-term contingency of an antecedent, a response or a behavior, and the consequence, and how those parts all play into each other. So looking at the example of how initiations are learned. With initiations, one of the things that's important to note here is that we're going to look at a motivating operation. There's some sort of motivation for the child to either look at the item or look at the person. So under here, we're looking at the appearance of a noteworthy item or event in the presence of an adult, followed by the child's response, which is that they initiate a bid for joint attention. So it's doing that eye gaze shift between the object and the adult and then back to the object. And the response is going to be, or the consequence is going to be positive reinforcement, which could be adding something to the environment or removing something from the environment to increase the likelihood of it in the future. And when I talk about positive, it's adding something to the environment to increase the likelihood in the future. And in this case, the positive reinforcement would be participation in the event or engagement with the item or helping to maximize reinforcement. So if we're looking at it socially, it might be if the child is being tickled and they look back at the adult for that, they get tickled some more. So it's increasing that social interaction. It could be playing a favorite game. It could be getting access to, maybe they're at Target and the child initiates a bid for an item and they go over and they play with the item together. And then as far as negative reinforcement, it could be alleviating fears or distress. So again, this is going to be removing something for the environment to increase the likelihood of it occurring again in the future. And when we look at things in behavioral with applied behavioral analysis, what we're really looking at is how the consequences really affect the response. So we're really looking at how do these play into it occurring again in the future. So we're going to do things to kind of manipulate that to make sure the child is being reinforced so that it occurs again more likely in the future. And a couple examples of initiation, looking at it with this three-term contingency. Again, the motivating operation. So if there's an adult holding a ball, the child shifts his gaze towards the adult and the ball, and as a result, the adult smiles and they interact with the child in the presence of the ball. Another example would be that a child completes a puzzle. So again, this is going to be more of a social example. So that child completes a puzzle, and they shift their gaze towards the adult, almost to say, hey, look what I just did, look what I finished, and the consequence is the adult praises the child. So they get that social praise because they completed a puzzle, they did something that they're proud of. A final example, and this is one of negative reinforcement, to show how removing something from the environment can reinforce the child. So let's say you're in a room and there's a dog, big dog that's barking in the same room. The child might look at the adult almost to show that they're scared of the dog or they're a little bit concerned about the dog being in the room, and the adult might either calm the child's fear or actually remove the dog from the room. So it's kind of gaining the attention to signify looking at the dog, looking at the adult, looking back at the dog, kind of that nervous back and forth. Let's take the dog out of the room for the child.
And in the second example, that the bid for attention could be the gaze shift, but we haven't talked as much about it. It could be a vocal response, look what I did. So soliciting a joint attention bid could also be vocal. I mean, obviously we're going for that, and these are younger examples too, or be language.
So just to show, illustrate one of the examples, if there's a child holding a ball, in comes the child, this is supposed to signify the gaze shift, and then from here, what occurs is they end up playing together, and as a result of them playing together, because of the eye gaze, this arrow here signifies that she's going to be more likely to engage in that joint attention again in the future, because she was reinforced down here with the social interaction of playing that game of ball. Now to show some examples of responding to bids for joint attention. So the difference here is going to be, while in the other example we talked about a motivator, here we're going to talk about what's called a discriminative stimulus, or an SD, which is essentially some sort of instruction that an adult puts in prior to, or some sort of interaction that the adult is actually initiating in this case. So it could be an adult's demands for the child's attention. So again, they're asking for that child's attention, hey, look over here. It could be, look, I have Legos. There's many examples, but again, this is going to be much more under the adult, or not even just an adult, it could be a peer. And again, as we talk about, we're talking a lot about an adult, this is where it typically develops, is between an adult and a child. But with our programming, we're always going to take it to with peers, because that's where we want the skill to evolve to, is that there's joint attention between peers. So the response is going to be the child looks at an item that an adult is referencing, and the reinforcement is going to be generalized reinforcer in the form of social attention. It could also be participation in the event or engagement with the item, and helping to maximize reinforcement. So some of them are going to be really similar to the examples for initiating joint attention, but the big difference here is that this is going to be much more under an adult or a peer's control, whereas initiations are the child responding to some sort of motivation that could be internal or something that they're seeing on the outside that they really enjoy. So just a couple examples. If there's a child and a peer playing at a centers table with Legos, in the school, how they all rotate around in different play areas, the peer might say, I found Legos, do you want to play? And the child's response would be, the child might look at the Legos and then look back at the peer, smile, and say yes. And the consequence that's going to have that response continue is that the children play with Legos together. Another example could be that while at Target, a child's mother says, look, it's Lightning McQueen. And then the child looks at Lightning McQueen and excitedly smiles at his mom. And they go over and they look at the toy together. And then a final example could be that an adult is sitting near a child and holds up a bubble machine. So again, this is the adult kind of initiating, like, hey, look, I've got this bubble machine. The child shifts their gaze between the adult, the bubble machine, and as a result, they actually play with the bubble machine. The adult might show the child how to use the bubble machine so that the child gets access to those bubbles. Okay. So now we're going to talk about just how do we assess joint attention. Kind of covered now, okay, what does joint attention look like? How do we assess it? How do we know, we talked about that there could be a whole continuum of joint attention. There's several different skills within joint attention. And it's really crucial that we might say, okay, there's a deficit in joint attention. Now the part that's crucial is we figure out where that deficit is. And there's several tools that I'm going to talk about today that we can use to identify where some of those deficits in joint attention are, so that we're teaching at the right part, so that we can get the most improvement in joint attention. One of the things we do, we actually use an assessment at Behavioral Directions that looks at the initiation for joint attention. And to do this, you actually place a toy on a table or the floor across from or near the child. One of the important things is, pretend this is the remote to activate the toy, is that it's a remote activated toy, because we're just going to have that toy be activated without the child see us actually activating it. And what we did in this assessment was we actually broke down what an initiation for joint attention looks like, and we came up with these as the following components. That the child looks at the toy upon activation. So think about that car flying off the table. Did the child look at the car flying off the table? That's the first step in joint attention, is that the child actually looks at that item that's being activated. The next thing we looked at, did the child look at the instructor, or not even just the instructor, the parent or the peer, whoever it is that we're looking at. So they look at the toy, then they look at the instructor, and then the final part is that they look back at the toy. And then from there, we're actually looking at the number of gaze shifts that occur during an interval. We looked at a 10-second interval to see, and we want to see this occur pretty quickly. We don't want it to be a long, drawn-out thing. The toy goes off the table, and they look at it, and then it takes them a long time to turn to the adult, and then back to the toy. This should be a pretty fluid response. We want to see it occurring quickly. So that's how we broke down.
Is this part of a standardized assessment? Is this part of the ABLS?
This is not part of the ABLS. This is an assessment that we've developed at Behavioral Directions based on.
Right, and some of the other New England Center for Children uses a version of it, and so it's an adapted version of what a center-based model for, a behavioral model for children with autism use. So it's very similar to what other school-based programs use.
So there's nothing on the ABLS that looks at joint attention?
We are gonna go there.
Okay.
Very soon.
This is the form that we use when we look at it. This is the data sheet that we look at. So again, down here on this column, we're looking at the 3 steps, and then down here along the last one is the number of gaze shifts per 10-second interval. And then how you would score this is you would do several trials, just because you really want to make sure you're not just getting, you want to make sure the response is consistent. You want to get an average of how the child's performing at this skill. So we're going to take trial 1 and see how the child did at this portion at step 2, at step 3, and then how many gaze shifts did occur during the 10-second interval. From there, what we do is we actually total up the number that were independent. So out of 3 trials, how many times did the child look at the toy? How many times did the child look back at the instructor? And then how many times did they look back at the toy again? And then down here, we're going to look at just the number of gaze shifts, what the average number of gaze shifts is per trial. What this assessment allows us to do that's really useful is, let's say for instance, the child looks at the toy upon activation 3 out of 3 times. But when we get to, does the child look at the instructor, they only did it 1 out of 3 times. It can show us exactly where we need to teach this skill, where that skill's breaking down. We don't want to spend time going back and teaching something that the child already knows. We want to go in and really spend our time focusing in on then how we can get the child to look at the adult after they look at the toy.
Because we see it as a behavioral chain. And it's not that if step 3 is occurring now 100% of the time, but 1 and 2 are not, then it's not that we would start there, obviously. But if we know that the beginning parts of the chain are occurring, then you'll see in the graph we're going to show, we actually start later in the teaching, and it helps to streamline and move faster.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that the adult isn't doing anything in this trial to seek the child's attention after the child has looked at the item.
Correct, not in this one. And when we actually start talking about the teaching of this skill, because we have a case study specifically for this skill, we'll talk about how the adult then prompts and teaches the child to then look back at the adult. But absolutely, the only thing the adult does here is they remotely activate the toy for the child. And that occurs prior to even step 1. That's in the initial baseline. Yes?
It's a great question because it really is a baseline. We use it as our baseline, but it's exactly that. It's a pure assessment without intervening. It's a great question.
But activation is intervening too.
If you think about what would naturally occur in the environment, so you walk into the store and a car activates, I mean, it's what would naturally occur in the environment. So yes, it is, I guess what we're saying here, it's instruction, it's not so much responding, but something occurs and it gets their attention and we want them to respond. That's not the part that's necessarily the teaching part, because that's what we want to naturally occur in the environment.
We're contriving some opportunities for it in a sense, and we're kind of mimicking something that would naturally occur in the environment, but we're going to contrive it so that we can have more opportunities to teach the skill as well as looking at it under a controlled setting.
So these are 3 trials with the same activation?
It It would be. For baseline, it would be, but then as we get into the program, we're gonna talk about that we're always gonna be making sure that we're expanding to novel items and additional items that are in the environment. And so that it's not just responding to one item, that we're always programming for that generalization to things other than maybe the car that goes off the table, for other items that are out there as well. But for the baseline, typically what we've done is we've used the same toy because it gives us the truest measure of where the child is. And we are selective in the toy that we use, because we're going to use a toy that we know the child is interested in, shows an interest that they like to play with it. You know, maybe they don't initiate a bid for it, but they might get excited when they see the toy. So we are going to kind of use some information that we know about the child ahead of time to make sure it's a toy they're going to be, if they're going to respond, let's use one that they are somewhat interested in. Yes?
Okay, I'll pick this apart.
No, go for it.
So it also, doesn't it matter who the adult is?
In some ways it does, absolutely. You want it to be an adult that the child is familiar with, because a child's probably going to be more likely to initiate that bid with a parent or maybe a sibling, or it could be, you know, another professional that they worked with for a long time. So yeah, absolutely, it is important that it's not a random person, that we're looking to see how they initiate a bid to a random person. Again though, on that point, as we get into the program, we are going to look into generalizing to novel people, to novel instructors, because we want to make sure that a child doesn't just initiate a bid to their parents or the people that they're closest with, but that they're also going to initiate to a bid to a novel person or someone new that they've just met. Yes?
And is there a way to measure a qualitative difference between the way a child initiates a bid to a parent or a trusted, known person versus a stranger? Shouldn't there be qualitative differences, and do you look at that at all?
This particular assessment doesn't look at that, but I do think that later, absolutely. And I think that's a really important thing because, you know, we want to look at, you know, we want to make sure too that there is a difference in how children respond to someone who's novel and new versus someone who they are extremely, you know, comfortable with and have that really established relationship with.
And I think when we probe generalization on these programs, like this is written as it's a written acquisition program, the generalized part to adults is not a novel. I mean, that would be a stranger awareness kind of issue, but it would be maybe a teacher up here at school, you know, a playmate down the street. So you have to actually get them, because, you know, it can look kind of contrived the way you teach it, to establish a skill and then generalize it. So, yeah.
And I was just thinking about kids on the spectrum who may not, like maybe more high functioning kids who don't differentiate their behavior very well between trusted adults and not from a stranger danger sort of perspective, but just from a nuance of reciprocity and relationship distinction.
If this is not occurring, obviously we want to start with a familiar person, and that's where we want to see it occur, and generally we don't see it just automatically overgeneralize across people. If it's already occurring across, then we probably wouldn't, you know, be looking at, then it would be like a discrimination program.
Okay. So there are different programs that would do that kind of thing.
Right, and I don't know that you would, probably wouldn't fall under joint attention.
Okay.
It would be more of a discrimination as to when to respond and when to not, like a non-responding program.
Thank you.
So in addition to that,